My mother-in-law got me fired from social work with invented ethics complaints. Her grandchild's abuse case later needed the forensic child advocate only I became. The email arrived at 8:43 a.m. on a Wednesday. Subject line reading, Mandatory Meeting Ethics Review Board, 2 p.m. today. I was in the middle of a home visit with a foster family, sitting at their kitchen table reviewing placement paperwork for a 3-year-old girl who'd been removed from her biological parents 2 weeks prior. My phone buzzed on the table and I glanced at the screen, seeing my supervisor's name. Gloria Mendez, who'd been my boss for 4 years and had written me glowing performance reviews every single time, was summoning me to an ethics review. My stomach dropped. Ethics reviews meant someone had filed a formal complaint about professional conduct. They were rare, serious, and could end careers if substantiated. I excused myself from the foster parents, promising to return the next day, and drove straight back to the Department of Children and Family Services downtown office. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. In 6 years as a social worker, I'd never had a single complaint. I was careful, thorough, documented everything obsessively. What could this possibly be about? I'd been working in child protective services since graduating with my MSW at 24, and at 30, I'd built a reputation as one of the most dedicated caseworkers in our county. I specialized in high-risk cases involving severe abuse and neglect, the kind of situations that required immediate intervention and careful documentation for potential criminal prosecution. My husband, Daniel Thornton, worked in finance and made enough that I could have chosen an easier career path, but this work mattered to me. I'd grown up with a mother who struggled with addiction, watched her cycle through recovery and relapse, seen how the system could help families or fail them depending on who was handling the case. I wanted to be one of the good ones. Daniel's mother, Lorraine Thornton, had never understood my career choice. She was a retired real estate agent who'd built a small empire of rental properties and viewed my social work salary with poorly disguised contempt. "You could do so much better," she'd told me at our wedding reception, after 3 glasses of champagne loosened her filter. "Daniel deserves a wife who contributes financially." I'd smiled and changed the subject, used to her subtle digs by then. Gloria was waiting in the conference room with 2 people I didn't recognize, a man and woman in business attire with briefcases and serious expressions. My supervisor's face was carefully neutral, which scared me more than if she'd looked sympathetic. "Meredith, this is Arnold Cho from the State Licensing Board, and Diana Westbrook from our Internal Ethics Compliance Division. Please sit down." I sat, my pulse hammering. Arnold opened a folder and slid several documents across the table. "Miss Thornton, we've received a formal ethics complaint regarding your conduct with clients over the past 8 months. The complaint alleges multiple violations of professional boundaries, falsification of case notes, and inappropriate disclosure of confidential client information." The words didn't make sense. I stared at the documents, seeing my name at the top of a complaint form, then a list of allegations that made my vision blur. Case hash 2847, allegedly told foster parents that biological mother was hopeless and would never regain custody. Case hash 3012, allegedly falsified home visit notes to expedite removal. Case hash 4156, allegedly discussed case details with unauthorized parties. Case hash 4891, allegedly showed bias against low-income families. Each allegation was specific, detailed, and completely false. "This isn't true," I said, my voice coming out steady despite the terror flooding my system. "None of this happened. Who filed this complaint?" Diana Westbrook's expression was sympathetic but professional. "The complaint was filed anonymously through our confidential ethics hotline. However, the complainant provided specific case numbers, dates, and quotes that we're obligated to investigate thoroughly." Arnold leaned forward. "Miss Thornton, these are serious allegations. If substantiated, they constitute grounds for license revocation and termination. We'll be conducting a full review of your case files, interviewing clients and colleagues, and examining all documentation. You're suspended from client contact effective immediately pending the outcome of this investigation." The room tilted. Suspended. I'd been handling 15 active cases, children in foster care who needed consistent support, families in crisis who depended on me showing up. "How long will the investigation take?" Gloria spoke gently. "These reviews typically take 4 to 8 weeks. Meredith, you'll need to transfer your cases to other workers today. I'll help you coordinate the handoffs." I wanted to argue, to demand to know who would make up such specific lies about me, but I could see in their faces that protest would only make me look guilty. I nodded and left the conference room, my legs barely holding me up. I spent the rest of that day handing off cases to colleagues who asked careful questions about why I was transferring everything so suddenly. I kept my answers vague. Personal leave, administrative issue, but I could see the speculation in their eyes. By the time I left the office at 7 p.m., the whispers had started. Someone had leaked that I was under ethics investigation. The looks I got walking through the hallway told me my reputation was already contaminated. I drove home in a fog, trying to understand who would do this to me and why. The specificity of the allegations suggested someone with access to my case files, someone who knew my clients and could fabricate believable scenarios. But I couldn't think of anyone who hated me enough to destroy my career this deliberately. Daniel was home when I arrived, working on his laptop at the kitchen table. I told him everything. watching his face cycle through shock, confusion, and then anger. "This is insane. You're the most ethical person I know. Who would make up these lies?" I shook my head, tears finally starting. "I don't know. Someone with access to my files. Someone who knows how the system works well enough to make fake allegations sound credible." Over the next 6 weeks, the investigation consumed my life. I met with Arnold and Diana 8 times, each meeting more humiliating than the last. They asked me to explain every decision I'd made on the cases mentioned in the complaint, justify every word in my documentation, account for every conversation I'd had with clients and colleagues. They interviewed the clients allegedly quoted in the complaint. The foster parents in case #2847 confirmed I'd never said the biological mother was hopeless. In fact, I'd been actively working a reunification plan. But Arnold noted that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and that the foster parents might be protecting me. The biological family in case #3012 said my home visit notes were accurate and thorough. Diana suggested they might not remember events correctly given the stress they'd been under. For case #4156, they couldn't identify who I'd allegedly disclosed information to, which made it impossible to disprove. Every piece of evidence I provided was questioned or reframed. The investigation wasn't searching for truth. It was building a case to justify the complaint. Daniel's support started cracking around week 3. We'd been married for 4 years, and while our relationship had always been solid, the stress of my suspension and the investigation was exposing fault lines I hadn't noticed before. He started making comments about how I must have made someone angry, that maybe I'd been too aggressive in my casework, that sometimes social workers crossed lines without realizing it. "I'm not saying you meant to do anything wrong," he said one night over a tense dinner, "but maybe you came across differently than you intended." I stared at him across the table. "You think I falsified records and violated confidentiality?" He looked uncomfortable. "I think you're very passionate about your work. Sometimes passion looks like bias." The implication was clear. My own husband was starting to doubt me. I stopped trying to convince him and focused on the investigation, gathering every piece of documentation I could find to prove my innocence. But the process felt rigged from the start. Someone had carefully crafted allegations that were specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough to be nearly impossible to definitively disprove. Week 5, I got called back for what Arnold called a preliminary findings meeting. I walked into that conference room knowing what was coming from the expression on Gloria's face. She looked devastated. Arnold opened a folder and began reading in a flat, bureaucratic tone. "After thorough review of case files, client interviews, and staff statements, we've determined that while we cannot definitively prove all allegations, the pattern of concerns raised and the specific nature of the complaints warrant disciplinary action. Effective immediately, your employment with the Department of Children and Family Services is terminated, and we're recommending your social work license be suspended pending further review by the State Licensing Board." Diana added, "You have the right to appeal this decision through the established grievance process. However, the evidence gathered during the investigation will be forwarded to the State Board, which will make the final determination about your professional license." I sat there absorbing the death of my career. 6 years of work, hundreds of children I'd helped, countless families I'd supported, all of it erased by anonymous lies that I couldn't fight because I didn't even know who'd made them up. "This is wrong," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "Someone fabricated these allegations to destroy my career, and you're letting them succeed without ever identifying who filed the complaint or investigating their motivations." Arnold's expression hardened. "Ms. Thornton, our confidential ethics hotline exists to protect whistleblowers from retaliation. Revealing the complainant's identity would undermine the entire system that allows people to report professional misconduct without fear." I wanted to scream that protecting anonymity was enabling someone to weaponize the system, but I could see it was pointless. The decision was made. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in covering the department's liability. I cleaned out my desk that afternoon while colleagues watched from doorways, some sympathetic, most uncomfortable. By 5 p.m., I was unemployed with my professional license under review, my reputation destroyed, and no idea who had done this to me or why. Daniel picked me up from the office since I couldn't stop crying enough to drive safely. He was quiet during the ride home, and when we got to our house, he said, "Maybe this is a sign you should try a different career path, something less stressful." I realized in that moment that he'd already decided I was guilty. He just didn't want to say it out loud. The State Licensing Board took another 3 months to complete their review. During that time, I applied for jobs outside social work, administrative positions, nonprofit coordination, anything that would pay bills while my license was under threat. I got turned down repeatedly. Most applications required disclosure of any ethics investigations or employment terminations. The ones that didn't rejected me after background checks revealed the suspension. I was functionally unemployable in any field adjacent to social services, which was the only field where my education and experience mattered. Daniel and I fought constantly. He resented supporting me financially, made passive-aggressive comments about me not pulling my weight, suggested I could work retail or food service if I was serious about contributing. His mother, Lorraine, visited more frequently during this period, always with unsolicited advice about how I should handle the situation. You need to accept responsibility and move on, she told me over coffee one afternoon while Daniel was at work. Denying what happened just makes you look worse. I finally snapped. I didn't do anything wrong. Someone lied about me and the system believed the lies. Lorraine smiled tightly. That's exactly the kind of defensive attitude that probably got you into this situation in the first place. The licensing board's decision came by certified mail on a Thursday morning. After reviewing the findings of the employer investigation and conducting our own examination of the allegations, the board has determined there is sufficient evidence of professional misconduct to warrant a 1-year suspension of your clinical social work license. You may apply for reinstatement after 12 months, contingent on completing ethics training and demonstrating rehabilitation. I read the letter 3 times, hands shaking. 1-year suspension, my license, my career, my professional identity, all taken away based on fabricated allegations I couldn't fight. The letter included a footnote mentioning that the confidential complainant had provided supplemental documentation supporting their claims, including screenshots of text messages and emails that demonstrated unprofessional conduct. I'd never sent any unprofessional texts or emails, which meant someone had fabricated evidence and submitted it to the licensing board as proof. This wasn't just someone trying to get me in trouble. This was systematic, deliberate destruction of my career by someone willing to commit fraud to accomplish it. I tried to think through who had both the motivation and access to pull this off. Another social worker? A disgruntled client? A colleague I'd unknowingly offended? Daniel asked for a separation 2 weeks after the licensing board decision. He framed it as needing space to process everything, but the subtext was clear. He was ashamed of being married to someone fired for ethics violations, regardless of whether I was actually guilty. His mother's influence was obvious in every word of his carefully prepared speech about how we'd grown apart and wanted different things. Lorraine had been pushing him to leave me since the investigation started. I'd heard them talking about it through the bedroom door one evening. She's damaged goods now, Lorraine had said. You could do so much better than someone who lost their career this way. Daniel moved into his mother's rental property while we figured things out, leaving me alone in the house we'd bought together 2 years earlier. I couldn't afford the mortgage on unemployment benefits. I started working 3 part-time jobs: retail at a clothing store, evening shift at a coffee shop, weekend data entry. The combined income barely covered my expenses. My master's degree in social work was useless. My 6 years of experience meant nothing. I was a 30-year-old with a destroyed career and a failing marriage, working minimum wage jobs while trying to figure out how my life had imploded so completely. The divorce papers arrived 4 months after the separation. Daniel wanted a clean break, equitable division of assets, no alimony since we'd been married less than 5 years. I signed them without fighting, too exhausted and broken to care about property or money. Lorraine had won. She'd gotten her son away from the inappropriate wife who'd embarrassed the family with an ethics scandal. I moved into a studio apartment, sold most of my belongings to cover moving costs and first month's rent, and tried to accept that this was my life now. Sometime during those months of working retail and serving coffee, I started reading case law about false ethics complaints and professional license suspension. I discovered that anonymous complaints were increasingly being weaponized to destroy careers, particularly in fields like social work, teaching, and healthcare, where ethics investigations could end professional practice even without criminal charges. There were documented cases of vengeful ex-spouses, competitive colleagues, and personal enemies using confidential reporting systems to file false allegations that were nearly impossible to fight. The anonymity protections meant the accused never knew who destroyed them or why. It was a perfect weapon for someone who wanted to ruin someone else with minimal risk. I couldn't shake the feeling that I knew my accuser. The specificity of the allegations, the access to my case files, the timing during a period when my marriage was already strained, it all felt personal rather than random. I started making a list of everyone who might have motivation to destroy my career. Colleagues I'd disagreed with professionally, clients whose cases hadn't gone the way they wanted, but none of it added up to someone willing to commit fraud by fabricating evidence. Then I thought about the screenshots of text messages and emails the licensing board had mentioned. I'd never sent inappropriate messages, which meant someone had created fake ones. That required technical knowledge and deliberate planning. It also meant someone had been setting me up for months, waiting for the right moment to file the complaint. I pulled out my old case files from the period mentioned in the allegations, looking for patterns. All 4 cases had one thing in common. They'd involved situations where I'd documented concerns about grandparent involvement, grandparents who were overstepping boundaries in foster placements, grandparents who were undermining reunification efforts, grandparents who were providing conflicting information to biological families and foster families, creating chaos in case management. The realization hit me like ice water. Lorraine. My mother-in-law had been complaining about my job for years, making comments about how social workers destroyed families and took children from good people. She'd asked intrusive questions about my cases, which I'd refused to answer citing confidentiality. She'd made pointed remarks about how I was too young and too idealistic to understand family dynamics. And she'd had access to my laptop several times when visiting our house. I'd left it open on the kitchen table, went to run errands, came back to find her, just checking her email, because her phone was dead. She could have looked through my files, taken screenshots, gathered information about my cases. The fabricated text messages and emails could have been created by anyone with basic Photoshop skills and knowledge of what my communications looked like. Lorraine had both the motivation to destroy my career, getting rid of the daughter-in-law she'd never approved of, and the means to do it through accessing my work information. But I had no proof, just suspicion based on patterns and opportunities. I tried talking to Daniel about my theory during one of our few post-separation conversations about dividing the last of our shared property. I think your mother filed the ethics complaint that got me fired. He looked at me with an expression between pity and contempt. That's insane, Meredith. My mother wouldn't do something like that. You need to stop blaming other people for your own mistakes. I pulled out the timeline I'd documented, the dates Lorraine had been at our house, the cases she'd asked about, the comments she'd made about my career. He shook his head. This is conspiracy thinking. You lost your job because you crossed ethical lines, and now you're trying to make my mother into a villain to avoid taking responsibility. This is exactly why we're getting divorced. The accusation stung because I could see he genuinely believed it. Lorraine had poisoned him against me so thoroughly that he couldn't even consider the possibility she might be behind the false complaint. I stopped trying to convince him and focused on the only thing I could control, getting my license reinstated so I could rebuild my career. The 1-year suspension period felt endless. I worked my minimum wage jobs, completed the required ethics training online, and tried to figure out what kind of social work I could do that wouldn't make me vulnerable to another false complaint. I couldn't go back to Child Protective Services. The risk of working with difficult families and complex situations was too high. I needed something with clear boundaries and documentation that couldn't be twisted into ethical violations. I started researching forensic social work, a specialized field that involved providing expert testimony in legal cases, conducting court-ordered evaluations, and working with law enforcement on criminal investigations involving children. Forensic social workers worked on specific assignments rather than managing ongoing cases, documented everything for court purposes, and operated with legal oversight that provided protection against false allegations. It was also a field that required additional training and certification beyond a standard social work license. I enrolled in a forensic social work certificate program, taking online classes at night after my retail shifts, studying on my breaks at the coffee shop. The program was expensive, $8,000 for a year-long certificate, and I had to take out more student loans to afford it. But it gave me a path forward, something to work toward during the year my license was suspended. I applied for license reinstatement exactly 12 months after the suspension began, submitting proof of completed ethics training, letters of recommendation from professors in my forensic program, and a personal statement explaining how I'd grown professionally during the suspension period. I didn't mention my belief that the original complaint was false or my suspicion about Lorraine. I'd learned that defending myself just made me look defensive. Instead, I focused on my commitment to ethical practice and my plans to work in forensic social work, where clear documentation standards would ensure professional accountability. The licensing board approved my reinstatement without a hearing. I got my license back with a permanent note in my file about the previous suspension. It would follow me for my entire career, but at least I could practice again. I immediately started applying for forensic social work positions, explaining in cover letters that I'd specialized in high-risk cases during my Child Protective Services career and had completed advanced training in forensic evaluation during my suspension. I got 3 interviews and 1 job offer, a contract position with a nonprofit organization that provided forensic interviews and evaluations for child abuse cases referred by law enforcement and courts. The pay was $52,000 annually, less than I'd made in Child Protective Services, but it was actual social work again. The forensic work was different from case management. Instead of managing ongoing relationships with families, I conducted single-point evaluations. A detective or prosecutor would refer a case involving alleged child abuse. I'd interview the child using specialized protocols designed to gather information without contaminating testimony, write a detailed report about my findings, and potentially testify in court about the child's statements and my professional assessment. The work was intense and emotionally difficult, but it was also clean. Every conversation was recorded. Every report was reviewed by attorneys. Every opinion I offered was backed by extensive documentation and research. There was no ambiguity that could be twisted into ethical violations. I was good at it. Years of working with traumatized children in Child Protective Services had taught me how to build rapport quickly, ask difficult questions gently, and recognize when a child was being truthful versus coached. The forensic protocols gave me structure to work within, and the legal oversight meant my work was constantly being scrutinized by multiple professionals. Within 6 months, I was handling some of the most complex cases in the region, the ones where criminal prosecution hinged on getting a child to disclose abuse details that could be corroborated with evidence. I took additional trainings in forensic interviewing, child sexual abuse evaluation, and expert witness testimony. I attended national conferences, networked with other forensic social workers and psychologists, built a reputation as someone who could handle difficult cases with professionalism and expertise. By my 3rd year in forensic work, I was making $78,000 annually and being called to testify in court regularly. I'd moved from the nonprofit to a hospital-based child advocacy center that paid better and offered more complex cases. I'd published 2 articles in forensic social work journals about interviewing techniques for children with developmental disabilities. I'd become the kind of specialist that prosecutors and defense attorneys both respected because my evaluations were thorough, fair, and evidence-based. I was finally rebuilding what Lorraine had destroyed: a professional reputation, financial stability, and pride in my work. I was 36 years old and had essentially restarted my career from scratch, but I was making it work. I didn't have contact with Daniel or Lorraine during those years. The divorce had been finalized, we'd divided our assets, and I'd moved on. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Daniel had remarried quickly, a woman Lorraine approved of who worked in marketing and came from money. They had a daughter shortly after getting married. I felt nothing about it except distant relief that I wasn't part of that family anymore. Then, on a Friday afternoon in late October, I got a call from Detective Raymond Foster with the County Sheriff's Department. He had a case he wanted me to evaluate: a 4-year-old girl named Lucy Thornton who'd been brought to the emergency room by her grandmother with suspicious injuries. The grandmother was reporting that the child had fallen downstairs, but the injuries didn't match the explanation. The child's mother was out of town on business, and the detective needed a forensic interview to determine what had actually happened. I agreed to do the interview and asked him to send over the case file. When it arrived an hour later, I saw the grandmother's name in the report: Lorraine Thornton. My hands started shaking as I read through the case details. Lucy Thornton was my ex-husband's daughter from his second marriage, the child I'd never met but had heard about from acquaintances. Lorraine had been babysitting while the mother, Vanessa, was traveling for work, and Daniel was at a business conference in Chicago. Lucy had been taken to the emergency room with bruising on her arms and legs, a fractured wrist, and what appeared to be old burn marks on her back. Lorraine was telling hospital staff that Lucy had fallen down the stairs at her house, but the emergency room physician noted that the injuries were inconsistent with a fall. They looked more like the child had been grabbed forcefully and possibly burned with cigarettes or a lighter. The hospital had called Child Protective Services, and CPS had called the Sheriff's Department because the injuries suggested criminal abuse. Detective Foster wanted me to interview Lucy to determine what had really happened and whether the grandmother's explanation was credible. I sat in my office staring at the file, my mind racing through the implications. Lorraine, who had destroyed my career with false ethics complaints 6 years ago, was now the subject of a child abuse investigation involving her own granddaughter, and I was the forensic evaluator assigned to determine the truth. I called Detective Foster back. I need to disclose a conflict of interest. Lorraine Thornton was my mother-in-law during my previous marriage. I'm divorced from her son, but given our history, I don't think it's appropriate for me to evaluate this case. There was a pause on the line. What kind of history are we talking about? Personal disagreements or something that would bias your professional judgment? I chose my words carefully. She and I had a difficult relationship when I was married to her son. I wouldn't be able to approach this case objectively. Detective Foster's voice became more interested. Does your history with her have anything to do with the ethics complaint that got your license suspended 6 years ago? I pulled your background as part of my due diligence on this case. I felt my face flush. Of course he'd looked into my professional history. The license suspension was a matter of public record. I was never able to prove it, but I believe my mother-in-law filed the false ethics complaint that ended my career in Child Protective Services. That's why I don't think I should evaluate this case. Detective Foster was quiet for a long moment. That actually makes me want you on this case more, not less. If there's any possibility Lorraine Thornton is the type of person who would file false complaints to destroy someone's career, that's relevant character information for assessing her credibility in this investigation, but I understand your concern about objectivity. Let me talk to my supervisor and the prosecutor. An hour later, Detective Foster called back with the county prosecutor, Amanda Fielding, on the line. She was direct and professional. Miss Harper, Detective Foster briefed me on your concerns about evaluating this case. Here's my perspective. You're the most qualified forensic interviewer in this region for complex child abuse cases. Your reputation is impeccable, your training is extensive, and your evaluations are trusted by both prosecution and defense attorneys. The conflict you've disclosed is actually beneficial to the case because it ensures you'll be extra careful about maintaining objectivity and documentation. If you're worried about your history with the grandmother affecting your evaluation, we can bring in a second independent evaluator to review your findings, but I want your expertise on this case. I thought about Lucy, a 4-year-old girl with suspicious injuries, possibly being abused by her grandmother. I thought about how no one had believed me 6 years ago when I'd tried to expose what Lorraine had done. I thought about the irony of Lorraine's granddaughter needing protection from the very person who destroyed my child protection career. I'll do the evaluation, I said, but I want everything documented and reviewed by a second professional. I won't give Lorraine any opportunity to claim I was biased or unprofessional. The interview with Lucy was scheduled for Monday morning at the Child Advocacy Center. I spent the weekend preparing, reviewing the medical records, studying the photographs of Lucy's injuries, and designing an interview protocol that would give her space to disclose what had happened without leading questions. The burn marks on her back were particularly concerning. They showed a pattern suggesting repeated abuse rather than a single incident. I'd seen similar injuries before in cases where caregivers used cigarettes or lighters to punish children. On Monday at 9 a.m., Detective Foster brought Lucy to the advocacy center. She was a small girl with brown hair and Daniel's eyes, clutching a stuffed rabbit and looking terrified. Her left wrist was in a cast, and she moved carefully like she was in pain. I introduced myself gently, showed her the interview room with its child-friendly furniture and toys, and explained that we were going to talk about what happened to her body. Lucy was initially reluctant to speak, giving one-word answers and avoiding eye contact. I spent 30 minutes just building rapport, playing with toys, letting her get comfortable. Finally, I asked about her wrist. "I know you hurt your arm. Can you tell me how that happened?" Lucy's voice was barely above a whisper. "I fell down." I nodded. "Where did you fall down?" She looked at her lap. "The stairs, at Grandma's house." I showed her anatomically detailed dolls that we used in forensic interviews. "Can you show me with these dolls how you fell?" Lucy took the child doll and made it tumble down a pretend staircase. Then she stopped and looked at me with an expression I'd seen countless times in my career, a child weighing whether to tell the truth or stick to a coach story. "Did anything else happen to your arm besides falling?" I asked gently. Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "Grandma got mad. She grabbed my arm really hard and twisted it. She said I was being bad." I kept my voice calm even as rage built in my chest. "Can you tell me why Grandma got mad?" Lucy started crying. "I spilled juice on her carpet. She said I was clumsy and stupid just like my daddy was when he was little. She grabbed my arm and twisted it, and I heard something crack. It hurt so much." I continued the interview carefully, documenting every detail. Lucy disclosed that Lorraine frequently grabbed her hard enough to leave bruises, locked her in closets when she misbehaved, and had burned her back with a lighter 2 months ago when Lucy had talked back. The burn marks had been hidden under clothing, and Lucy had been too scared to tell her parents. Lorraine had told Lucy that if she ever told anyone what happened, Grandma would make sure her mommy and daddy went away forever. It was textbook abuse paired with threats to ensure silence. The interview lasted 90 minutes and was recorded on video with audio backup. When it was over, I sat with Lucy while a victim advocate from the center gave her juice and cookies, and I reviewed my notes. Everything Lucy had described matched the physical evidence. The wrist fracture was consistent with a twisting injury. The bruises were consistent with grabbing. The burn marks showed a deliberate pattern. This wasn't a case of a child falling downstairs. This was a grandmother who'd been abusing her granddaughter and using fear tactics to keep her quiet. I wrote my report that afternoon, detailing Lucy's disclosures, analyzing the consistency between her statements and the medical evidence, and providing my professional opinion that the child had been physically abused by her grandmother over a period of months. I noted that Lucy's affect during the interview was consistent with a child disclosing true abuse. She showed fear when talking about her grandmother, used age-appropriate language, and provided specific details that could be corroborated. I also noted that Lorraine's explanation of a fall downstairs was inconsistent with the pattern and severity of injuries. My report went to Detective Foster and Prosecutor Fielding by 5 p.m. Within an hour, they'd obtained an arrest warrant for Lorraine Thornton on charges of child abuse, assault, and intimidation of a witness. She was arrested that evening at her home. Daniel called me at 9 p.m., his voice shaking with rage. "What the hell did you do? My mother was just arrested because of you. I know you're bitter about the divorce, but using my daughter to get revenge is unforgivable." I kept my voice level. "Daniel, I conducted a forensic interview with Lucy because she presented at the emergency room with suspicious injuries. During that interview, she disclosed repeated physical abuse by your mother. I documented her statements and provided them to law enforcement. I didn't fabricate anything. I didn't coach her. I did my job as a forensic social worker." Daniel's voice cracked. "You're lying. My mother would never hurt Lucy. You're making this up to get back at her for whatever you think she did to you." I felt a surge of anger. "Your mother destroyed my career 6 years ago with false ethics complaints because she wanted me out of your life. She succeeded. We got divorced, you remarried, and I rebuilt my career in a different field. I have no reason to fabricate abuse allegations against her now except that your daughter told me what really happened to her injuries, and it's my legal and ethical obligation to report it." There was silence on the line. Then Daniel said quietly, "What do you mean she destroyed your career? The ethics complaints were from clients. My mother had nothing to do with that." I laughed bitterly. "Your mother filed those complaints anonymously after accessing my work files when she visited our house. She fabricated evidence, made up allegations, and used the confidential ethics system to get me fired without any possibility of defending myself. I tried to tell you 6 years ago, but you wouldn't believe me. You chose her over me, and now your daughter is paying the price for you protecting an abuser." Daniel hung up on me. But 2 hours later, Vanessa called, Daniel's second wife, Lucy's mother. Her voice was tight with controlled emotion. "Meredith, I need to know the truth. Did Lucy really tell you that Lorraine abused her?" I explained the interview in general terms, respecting the confidentiality of the forensic evaluation while giving Vanessa enough information to understand what her daughter had disclosed. Vanessa started crying. "I knew something was wrong. Lucy has been scared of Lorraine for months, but she wouldn't tell me why. Lorraine kept insisting Lucy was just going through a difficult phase. Daniel always took his mother's side when I raised concerns. I felt like I was going crazy. I'd felt the same way 6 years ago. doubting my own perceptions because Lorraine was so convincing, and her son always believed her. Vanessa, Lucy disclosed specific abuse over a period of months. The medical evidence supports her statements. This isn't a misunderstanding or a difficult phase. Your daughter was being hurt by her grandmother, and she was too scared to tell anyone until a mandated reporter triggered an investigation. Vanessa's voice became harder. Daniel needs to hear this from you directly. He worships his mother. He won't believe me, but he might believe you. The meeting happened 3 days later at Prosecutor Fielding's office. Daniel, Vanessa, Detective Foster, the prosecutor, and me, all sitting around a conference table while Fielding explained the evidence against Lorraine. She presented the medical records, the photographs of Lucy's injuries, excerpts from my forensic interview report, and expert medical testimony about the inconsistency between Lorraine's explanation and the actual injuries. Daniel's face went from defensive to shocked to devastated as the evidence accumulated. When Fielding finished, he looked at me across the table. Is this really true? Did Lucy actually tell you my mother hurt her? I met his eyes steadily. Yes. Your daughter disclosed repeated physical abuse by your mother, including being grabbed hard enough to break her wrist, being locked in closets, and being burned with a lighter. She was terrified of telling anyone because your mother had threatened her. I documented everything according to forensic interview protocols. The recording of the interview is available for review. Daniel put his face in his hands. Vanessa reached over and touched his shoulder, her expression both sympathetic and furious. Your mother has been abusing our daughter for months, and you wouldn't listen when I tried to tell you something was wrong. Prosecutor Fielding cleared her throat. Mr. Thornton, there's additional information you should be aware of. During the investigation into your mother's abuse of Lucy, we subpoenaed her financial records and electronic devices. We found evidence that she'd been researching how to file anonymous ethics complaints 6 years ago, around the time your ex-wife was fired from Child Protective Services. We also found draft emails and documents on her computer that matched the fabricated evidence submitted to the licensing board at that time. It appears your mother did in fact file false ethics complaints against Meredith in order to destroy her career. Daniel looked up, his face gray. Why would she do that? I answered before anyone else could. Because she wanted me out of your life, and she was willing to destroy my career to accomplish it. She succeeded. We got divorced, you remarried someone she approved of, and I spent years rebuilding my professional reputation. Your mother is a person who systematically abuses those she perceives as threats or obstacles. 6 years ago, I was the threat. Now apparently your daughter has become enough of an annoyance that your mother started abusing her too. The horror on Daniel's face was satisfying in a dark way. He was finally understanding who his mother really was. The trial took 8 months to reach court. During that time, Lucy was placed in therapy to address the trauma of the abuse and the stress of the legal proceedings. Vanessa filed for full custody and a restraining order preventing Lorraine from having any contact with Lucy. Daniel was devastated but cooperative, attending therapy himself to process the reality that his mother was an abuser and that he'd enabled her for years by refusing to believe the women in his life who tried to warn him. He called me once during those months to apologize. I should have believed you 6 years ago. I should have questioned the ethics complaints instead of assuming you were guilty. I'm sorry for how I treated you during the divorce. I let my mother manipulate me into abandoning you when you needed support. The apology was years too late, but I accepted it for what it was, a man finally recognizing how thoroughly his mother had controlled him. I testified at Lorraine's trial about my forensic interview with Lucy, walking the jury through the protocols I'd used, the statements Lucy had made, and my professional assessment of the abuse. The defense attorney tried to discredit me by bringing up my previous ethics suspension, suggesting I was biased against Lorraine because of our personal history. I calmly explained that the ethics suspension had been based on false complaints later determined to be fabricated by Lorraine herself, and that my evaluation of Lucy's case had been conducted according to strict forensic protocols with secondary review by independent professionals. The prosecutor entered Lorraine's computer files as evidence, showing the jury that she'd researched ethics complaints and drafted fake documents 6 years earlier. The jury convicted Lorraine on all charges: child abuse, assault, intimidation of a witness, and additionally on charges related to the false ethics complaints she'd filed against me. That last set of charges had been added after prosecutors discovered she'd violated several criminal statutes by fabricating evidence and submitting fraudulent complaints to state agencies. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in prison, noting that Lorraine had shown a pattern of calculated manipulation and abuse spanning years, targeting both family members and unrelated victims with deliberate intent to destroy lives and reputations. She'd be eligible for parole in 8 years. Lorraine showed no remorse during sentencing, maintaining that everyone was lying about her and that she was the real victim. The judge wasn't sympathetic. Miss Thornton, you abused a 4-year-old child in your care and attempted to silence her through threats and fear. Before that, you destroyed your daughter-in-law's career through systematic fraud. You've shown yourself to be a person willing to harm anyone who stands in your way. This sentence reflects the severity of your actions and the danger you pose to vulnerable people. The day after Lorraine's sentencing, I received a letter from the state licensing board. They were formally clearing my record of the previous ethics suspension, acknowledging that the complaints had been fraudulent and apologizing for the investigation and disciplinary action I'd experienced. The letter offered to expunge all references to the suspension from my professional file. It was 6 years too late to save my job at Child Protective Services or my marriage or the years I'd spent working minimum wage while trying to rebuild my career, but it was official vindication. I'd been right all along. I called Daniel and told him about the licensing board's letter. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad they cleared your record. You deserved that years ago. I'm sorry it took my daughter getting hurt for the truth to finally come out." I could have been petty and pointed out that if he'd believed me 6 years ago, maybe Lucy would never have been alone with Lorraine. But there was no point. He'd spend the rest of his life knowing he'd chosen his abusive mother over his innocent wife, and that choice had eventually put his daughter in danger. That was punishment enough. Lucy is 7 now, 3 years after the trial. She's doing well in therapy, and the physical scars from her abuse have faded. The emotional scars will take longer, but she has supportive parents who believe her and protect her now. I see her occasionally for follow-up evaluations to assess her progress and provide recommendations for continued treatment. She always remembers me as the person who listened when she finally told the truth about Grandma. I'm 42 years old, established as one of the leading forensic child abuse evaluators in the state. I've testified in dozens of trials, trained hundreds of professionals in forensic interviewing techniques, and published extensively about child protection and evidence-based evaluation. My career is better than it ever would have been if I'd stayed in Child Protective Services. The false ethics complaints that destroyed my first career inadvertently created the expertise that saved Lucy and exposed Lorraine. There's an irony to that. Lorraine's attempt to ruin me backfired so spectacularly that I became the person who stopped her from abusing her granddaughter. She'd said I was too idealistic to understand family dynamics. Turns out she was right that I didn't understand her family dynamics. I didn't understand how someone could abuse their grandchild while maintaining a facade of respectability. But I learned. And that knowledge made me better at protecting children from people exactly like her. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.